First of all, to all our visitors this evening, I want to welcome you to Congregation Beth Yeshurun. We're delighted this evening to co-sponsor with St. Paul's United Methodist Church this very special program. I want to thank St. Paul's Senior Pastor, Dr. Jeff McDonald, and Pastor Dr. Bill Curley for their support for this program, and especially Barbara Buckner of St. Paul's, who was instrumental in initiating and in organizing this event. I also want to thank our senior rabbi, Brian Strauss, who's always been supportive of events like this. And I have to thank our program director, Jennifer Rosenzweig, who always makes everything at Beth Yeshurun run so smoothly. Our speaker tonight, Professor Susannah Heschel, is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College and the chair of the Judaic Studies program. Her scholarship focuses on Jewish and Protestant during the 19th and 20th centuries, including the history of biblical scholarship. She also is a scholar of Jewish scholarship on Islam and the history of anti-Semitism. Dr. Heschel has been a visiting professor at the universities of Frankfurt and Cape Town, as well as Princeton. She's the recipient of numerous grants, including from the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, and year-long Rockefeller Fellowship at the National Humanities Center. In 2011 and 2012, she held a fellowship at the Wissenschaftsfolk College in Berlin. Did I pronounce that correctly? I love saying that. Anyway, Dr. Heschel is the author or editor of numerous books and over 100 articles. Most of us are aware that Dr. Heschel's father, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, was a very close friend of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and that he famously walked with Dr. King on the march from Montgomery to Selma, Alabama in March of 1965. There's an iconic photograph of Rabbi Heschel in the front row of the march near Dr. King. But there is much more to the story than a photograph, and I imagine we'll hear some of that this evening. But over the last few years in particular, it has become painfully apparent that there is so much more that we need to do today to further the cause of justice, equality, respect, and understanding in our nation. And Susannah Heschel has been a passionate voice to further the agenda of the civil rights movement that started 60 years ago. So, without further delay, let's hear from Dr. Susannah Heschel, and let's give her a big Texas welcome.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Morgan. I also, Barbara, there you are. Barbara, thank you so much for arranging everything for my visit. I appreciate it so much, and we all thank you for bringing us together this evening. And I thank everybody who was helpful in arranging my trip, my visit. It's great to be back in Houston and back at this congregation, which I have visited just last year with my children. It's a wonderful place to come and pray on Shabbat. So I want to talk today, first of all, because I'm a historian, I'd like to talk a little bit about Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement, just to review some of the complexity, because there were many different kinds of issues that came up for the Jewish community in terms of the civil rights movement. But I also want to tell you a bit about my father's relationship with Dr. King and why the civil rights movement was so important to my father, and why I think it is, in fact, something that was and remains very important to Jews. I see the civil rights movement as an ecumenical movement. And in fact, let me just say a word about that first before I go to the historical. I just want to point out that for my father and for many rabbis who joined in the civil rights movement, who had all come as refugees to this country, who left Nazi Europe and came here, what this meant, what it meant. My father was born in Warsaw, but was a student in Berlin. He went to Berlin in 1927, and he finished his doctoral dissertation in 1932, just a couple of weeks before Hitler came to power. He, of course, wanted to get out of Germany. He had trouble because in order to get a PhD from the university, you had to publish your dissertation. But no German publisher would publish a book by a Jew at that point. So finally, it was published in Poland, and he had to get permission from the university, and I have the letters that he received from the dean, signed Heil Hitler. Took about 3 years. Finally, he got the degree, and he struggled to get out, of course, to get out of Germany. But during the time that my father was in Germany, there were Protestant theologians who were saying, not all, but some who supported Hitler, who were saying that the Old Testament is a Jewish book and has no place in the Christian Bible. There were people who referred to Hitler as Christ and called Jesus a Führer. There were those who also rewrote the New Testament, who said Jesus was not a Jew but an Aryan, a German. I know it sounds absurd to us today, but these were also Protestant theologians who were professors at universities and bishops and pastors. There was even a bestseller in Germany, by the way, that said that Jesus was born in Schleswig-Holstein, if you can imagine. But there was a desire to repudiate everything Jewish, to eradicate, to cleanse Christianity of anything Jewish. They published their own version of the New Testament, of the Gospels. They got rid of Paul. Jesus was an Aryan. Yes. Paul, what can you do? He said himself in his own writings that he's a Jew, he's a Pharisee, so they couldn't redefine him, so they got rid of him. Now, for my father to come from that environment, and by the way, one of his own professors was involved in that group, Johannes Hempel, my father to come to America and to find Dr. King making the Hebrew Bible, the prophets, and the Exodus from Egypt central to the civil rights movement, it meant a great deal to him. There was a way in which the civil rights movement, with its emphasis on the Exodus, on the prophets, the motto from the prophet Amos, let justice roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. This was extraordinary, given what my father had experienced just a couple of decades earlier as a student in Germany. It was extraordinary, I think, for a lot of Jews to hear our Bible being lifted up, to be such an extraordinary inspiration for all Americans, to soften hardened hearts. It inspired me. It made me want to become a professor of Hebrew Bible. It made me fall in love with the Bible in a way that, you should forgive me, Hebrew school didn't do. Shh, don't tell anybody. So I think the civil rights movement was a great gift to the Jews. It was a gift to us at a time after we had just lost 6 million Jews murdered. How do you recover your soul after that? This was a great gift. It inspired so many young Jews to risk their lives to go to the South, to march, to join the Freedom Riders, to help register black voters, and some were killed, some were beaten. Now, as Rabbi Morgan said, the photograph of my father marching with Dr. King and the march from Selma to Montgomery, yeah, that photo has become iconic. I can tell you that at the time it wasn't. That is, as a child, the fact that my father had been involved in civil rights didn't mean anything to anybody. It really, I noticed, it really didn't become something important to Jews until around the early 1980s, and then all of a sudden. Now, we have to ask why, but I'll just say a word about what that relationship also meant to my father. You know, if you think about it, my father came from a rather sheltered world. He was raised in a Hasidic family in Warsaw, very religious. Then he was in Berlin. His life was saved by the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. He was plucked, as he said, plucked like a brand from the fires of Europe, brought to Cincinnati, where he lived for the years of the war, desperately trying to rescue his mother and 3 sisters who were caught there, many friends, extended family. My father then moved to New York City after the war and was a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Obviously, he had no students who were Black, no colleagues who were African American. Everybody was white and Jewish, and my father lived in a rather narrow circle, very busy with his own writing and studying. And yet, when my father spoke about racism in 1963 at a conference in Chicago where he first met Dr. King, he spoke with so much passion. Everybody was amazed. Where does the passion come from? He said racism is Satanism, unmitigated evil. Racism, he said, is a denial of God. People were stunned, and they still are. Many scholars say this was the most passionate denunciation of racism by a white person since William Garrison in the 19th century. Where did the passion come from? That's where he met Dr. King for the first time, by the way, in Chicago in 1963. And they bonded. What brought them together? They came from such different backgrounds. And of course, we know it was the Bible, their faith. It's also their religious sensibilities, because I found in reading some of their speeches, for instance, they used similar language, and that was striking. I can tell you that I read Dr. King's papers from when he was a student that have been collected by Claiborne Carson. And it was striking to me. And Dr. King wrote for his New Testament course at seminary. He said very clearly, Jesus was a Jew. He belonged to the Jewish people. Now imagine, he was going to seminary at the same time that these Protestant theologians in Germany, who were, by the way, famous theologians, these weren't just anybody, these were the people in biblical studies who were the most important and influential, and they said, no, Jesus was an Aryan. And here's Dr. King. Now, I want to say that there is something very striking to me to this day about the affinities between Jewish theologians and Black theologians, especially the way they write about early Christianity. I find that they write about Jesus as a Jew, committed to Judaism, a loyal Jew, whose goal was to make other Jews more religious. And yes, he argued, which is a good Jewish thing to do, argue with your clergy. And he didn't try to found a new religion, they say. It was Paul. Paul who really founded Christianity. That's a Jewish argument, and that's the argument of most Black theologians. And I find that affinity very striking. Why? Where does it come from? Jews want to claim Jesus as one of ours, and Paul started the religion about Jesus. For Black theologians, the roots are a little different. In the days of enslavement in the United States, white slave owners would bring in white preachers who would quote from Paul and the Pauline epistles and tell Black slaves, you have to be obedient to your master. That's Paul. And of course, if you're enslaved, you don't accept that. Instead, you identify with Jesus as the person who's going to liberate you, with Moses, with the prophets who speak about justice. Moses will take you out of enslavement. And so there is a separation in Black theology between the figure of Jesus and the figure of Paul that has historical roots and continues to this day. What about on the Jewish side? We don't have, as we know, an outright condemnation of enslavement in the Bible. We have laws that say how you should treat a slave, but frankly, I still wouldn't want that, and I don't think any of us would. Maimonides said, the fact that we don't have a prohibition against enslavement, well, we should, but we weren't yet morally ready, consciously ready to understand that. But it's wrong. And yet, historians have looked into Jewish-owned enslavement plantations in the Caribbean, in Brazil, that there was a Hebrew prayer to purchase a slave. What did you do, for example, on Passover? The historian Natalie Z. Davis found a Haggadah in a library that was put together in the Caribbean. How do you sit at your Passover Seder and talk about freedom from slavery when your slaves are serving you your dinner? How do you do that? We have a history. We tend to think of ourselves as Jews as innocent of the worst manifestations of racism, but it's not true. And I worry, as my father worried, that this Jewish innocence might prevent us from recognizing the racism that we have, that we participate in, and that we have in our hearts and that we have to address. We came to this country in the 19th century and declared that we had left behind the Egypt of Europe and its anti-Semitism, and now we had reached the promised land of America. This was said even in Charleston, South Carolina, in the 1840s and 50s, a slave trading city. It's not the promised land. Why do we ignore that? What is our history? In their views of enslavement, in the treatment of enslaved people, Jews in the Caribbean, in Brazil, in antebellum United States were largely indistinguishable from Christian neighbors. Some rabbis, for example, and Jewish leaders condemned enslavement and said it. Others said, well, slavery doesn't violate the Bible, so it's okay. What is striking, though, is that in the 1960s, rabbis, like Christians, did not try to justify segregation through the Bible. That became really impossible in the 1960s. When my father first got involved in the civil rights movement, he was criticized. One of the things that Jews like to say, a little too often, I think, is, shh, shush still. Don't say anything in public. Keep it quiet. And my father was criticized for being outspoken. He was outspoken on many issues. On a national level, there were, of course, Jews who were involved in some of the most important developments in the civil rights movement, and we need to remember that. Schools that were funded by Julius Rosenwald, Jews who were involved as president and funders of the NAACP, the SCLC, Jewish lawyers who were at the forefront of the Scottsboro Boys defending them, and Brown versus Board of Education, the integration of the University of Mississippi, and all kinds of other national movements. But at the same time, support for the civil rights movement among Jews was class-based, generation-based, and geography-based. Wealthier Jews in the North gave support to the civil rights movement. Working-class Jews opposed integration, even those whose college-aged children were going to the South to protest. Too often, Jews spoke about the civil rights movement as something that was happening in the South and ignored the North. Some of you may remember when Dr. King went to Chicago, to the neighborhood of Cicero, and you remember how terribly he was treated there in Illinois by white people. Integration was an issue in the North as well as the South. Too often, Jews abandoned urban areas, moved to the suburbs because they wanted to live in a segregated neighborhood. And yet, roughly 2/3 of the white freedom riders were Jews, young Jews. 1/3 of the volunteers in the 1964 Mississippi voter registration movement. And you know, I'm sure, about the 3 young men who were murdered by the Klan in Mississippi. You may know also that as the FBI was looking for their bodies and dredging the swamps in Mississippi, they came across numerous bodies of young black men who had also been murdered by the Klan, their bodies dumped in a swamp. It was because there were also 2 white men with the 3rd black man that the FBI got involved. It's also true in the South that Jews could have been found at both ends of the political spectrum. Even in Selma, there's one photograph of the civil rights movement leaving the town of Selma, walking to the Pettus Bridge, and in the background, you see a big billboard that says Tepper's Department Store. It was the department store of this small town, Selma, and it was owned by a Jewish man who was a member of the White Citizens Council, that is, a segregationist group. It's an interesting juxtaposition, and I wish it would be in more of the photographs. There were rabbis in the South who were outspoken from the pulpit in support of the civil rights movement. Some were silent. Some said, well, let's take it easy. Let's be more moderate. For example, Rabbi Milton Grafman in Birmingham, Alabama. Well, what's interesting is Rabbi Grafman was viewed as at the forefront of the civil rights movement, and yet he was one of the white clergy in Birmingham who urged Dr. King to tamp it down, to be more moderate, to take his time. And that's when Dr. King wrote the famous letter from a Birmingham jail. But there were others. I remember reading a memoir of Rabbi Seymour Atlas, who was the rabbi of a synagogue in Selma. And he met Dr. King, and this was in the 1950s. And Dr. King said that he would like to improve his Hebrew, to read the Bible in Hebrew. And Rabbi Atlas was thrilled and asked Dr. King to come, and they would study together in his office. And you know what? The congregation was annoyed. They told Rabbi Atlas, and he reports this in his memoir, that Dr. King should come through the back door, the service entrance, and not through the front door of the synagogue. Rabbi Atlas became so disgusted with the congregation that he gave up and moved back to the north. He was an Orthodox rabbi, by the way, and it's one of the things that sometimes gets neglected. There were Orthodox rabbis also at Selma, as well as Reform and Conservative. There was also violence. 10% of the bombings were directed against Jewish institutions, synagogues, during the Civil Rights era. Tension also came about in all kinds of ways. For instance, Rabbi Perry Nussbaum was in Jackson, Mississippi, and he visited as a clergyman, the Jewish freedom riders who were in prison in Jackson, and then he was criticized for visiting them by congregants, by colleagues. They said, you know, you have to keep in mind the unwritten rules of race in the South. Don't get involved. You know, it was also quite important to the prisoners that a rabbi came to visit them in the horrible conditions of the prison. And in fact, when the clergy came to the prison, all the prisoners were offered the opportunity, men, women, Jews, Christians, white, black, to come to the service. And so Rabbi Nussbaum said with great pride that he had conducted the first racially integrated worship services in the South when he went to visit those prisons. It happened in the North too. Rabbi Walter Plout was a Reform rabbi in Great Neck, New York, and he wanted to join a freedom ride. There was a special one for clergy, and he wanted to go. There were 7 black Protestant ministers, 7 white Protestant ministers, and 4 rabbis to get on a bus and go through the South to integrate the bus system. And what happened? He announced that he would be away from the congregation for a few days, and the congregation in Great Neck was furious. The president of the congregation sent him a telegram ordering him not to go, because this coming Shabbat there would be 4 bar mitzvahs. What's more important? But he went anyway. Now, I think it's important for us to remember also some of the intellectuals in the Jewish world who opposed the civil rights movement in an outspoken way, in magazine articles, in Commentary magazine, for example. Lucy Davidovich is a great historian whom I knew, very fine person in all kinds of ways, who wrote an important book about the Holocaust and taught at Yeshiva University, but she opposed it. She said, black nationalists are like Nazis, anti-Semitic like Russian peasants. Quote, well, I don't want to quote her because it's too ugly what she said. In the 1970s, as late as the 70s, Hillel Halkin came out with a book called Letters to an American Jewish Friend, and he said, why are you Jews getting involved in a cause that's not your own? And I think that's a very important point for us. A cause that's not your own. Jews should be involved in Jewish concerns, he wrote. Why care about the problems of non-Jews? Then there were liberals like Paul Weiss, a professor of philosophy at Yale, who asked, why can't blacks be more like Jews? And he said it directly on television in the Dick Cavett show to James Baldwin. We used to hear that over and over again, and I can't imagine how he could put up with that. Why can't you be more like the Jews? Yeah? And the point being, well, the Jews, they pulled themselves up on their own. Is that really true? Jews were white. Jews had a certain, in fact, privilege of being white. After World War II, soldiers that came back, there was a special federal housing plan that gave you money to help buy a house, a down payment on a mortgage, which was great, except the suburbs were restricted. They were certainly restricted to white people, sometimes only Christians. You probably know that. Shaker Heights, Ohio, Jews couldn't buy anything there, and it was also blacks. So there were some areas where Jews couldn't buy a house, but it was worse if you were black. Think about Levittown, for example. So we had, in fact, a certain privilege of white skin that black people didn't have. We didn't just pull ourselves up on our own. Now, we also have the movement of black nationalism, Black Panthers, for example, in the 60s, who arose and who've gotten, I think, a very unfair reputation. For one thing, Mark Dolinger has pointed out, thanks to black nationalism, Jews began paying more attention to Zionism and thinking also about Jewish nationalism. Black studies started at universities, and that's why we then asked for Jewish studies programs. We were inspired. But as you probably know, there was a period after Dr. King was assassinated when things went awry. My father died in 1972, Dr. King died in 1968. What happened? People often ask, what went wrong? What happened to the Black-Jewish alliance? So let's think about it. The issue in the 1970s was affirmative action. All the major Jewish organizations, almost all of them, opposed affirmative action on the grounds that it wouldn't be good for Jews and filed amicus briefs with the Supreme Court opposing affirmative action. I remember once at Dartmouth where I teach, we had a person who was a president of a college who came to speak and said, yes, affirmative action is really bad for the Jews. And I raised my hand and I said, you know, I'm a Jew, and actually affirmative action has helped me enormously because as a woman, and you know what he said? Oh, I never thought of that. Okay, so there was that. There was a remark by Jesse Jackson that called New York City Hymietown. It was reported in a paper. Jews were furious about that and offended by that, and he apologized. He apologized on national television at the Democratic National Convention. And yet, in 1983, when there was the 20th anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington, all the Jewish organizations were invited to participate. And when they heard that Jesse Jackson would be one of the many 30 or 40 speakers, they all withdrew, except one, New Jewish Agenda, stayed and went. I was there too. But the man apologized. And my black friend said to me, why don't the Jews accept the apology? And indeed, I would have to say, as a scholar of the history of anti-Semitism, calling New York Hymietown is not nice, but my goodness, for the last 2,000 years, there have been an awful lot worse things said about Jews. And I don't know of anyone who's apologized in a national media for that. Shouldn't we accept an apology? I think so. And I think the result of failing to accept the apology resulted in the rise of Louis Farrakhan, who really is a dreadful person and has said some of the worst things about Jews and Judaism that have ever been said in this country. What motivated people to speak out on civil rights and to get involved? I think there were many different motivations. A sense of justice, for one thing, a sense of showing that we're American, and we're part of this country and this culture. It was also, I think, a response to the Holocaust. Joachim Prince, a rabbi in Newark, who spoke at the March on Washington in 1963, said, "Because of the Holocaust, I have to speak out." But there were also others who said that because of the Holocaust, I have to just worry about Jews and nobody else. Which way? In the 1960s, and continuing really until this day, there were two paths for Jews in America. One path was Meir Kahane, who said, "Never again to the Jews." And the other path was my father, who said, "Never again to any human being." The tragedy is that Meir Kahane, who moved to Israel and was condemned by the Knesset in Israel, and his political party banned by the Knesset, and when he stood up to speak in the Knesset, everybody else walked out. And yet, today, he's dominating the Knesset, Kahanism. How has that come about? Let's not let that happen. Now, I want to just say a little bit about my father and Dr. King, if I may, in a personal way. My father's friendship with Dr. King was intense and wonderful. It meant a lot to my father. I think for my father it was something wonderful to have a friendship with someone like Dr. King, with a black pastor from the South, but also with someone who spoke about nonviolence. And maybe we should remember what nonviolence actually meant in those days. Nonviolence didn't just mean if somebody hits you, don't hit them back. People spend months and months training in nonviolence before they tried to integrate a lunch counter, for example. And what were they training? To change the way they think, the way they feel, the way they treat other human beings, the way they are in the world. Nonviolence was about a different kind of heart and soul. Nonviolence also meant that the person who attacks you, you treat that person with dignity. That person, too, is a child of God. I think that's very important, and I think it's a lesson that we should bring back to this country. I think nonviolence training that was developed in those days, in the 50s and 60s, is something that's worthwhile for our kids and our students. Nonviolence training created people whom I knew, and I'd like to just mention the people that my father was involved with in those days in the civil rights movement: Andrew Young, Reverend C.T. Vivian, James Lawson, and I can go on with a list of names, Jesse Jackson. I have to tell you something. First of all, they are gentle people, strikingly gentle and deeply refined. When I was with C.T. Vivian, Reverend Vivian, I just felt I was in the presence of someone holy. He reminded me of the Hasidic Rebbes that I met in my childhood. And I know it reminded my father in Selma. My father wrote it in his diary. He said marching in Selma reminded him of walking with Hasidic Rebbes in Europe. You know, to walk with a Rebbe is something very special in Jewish tradition. It's not just taking a walk, it's an experience. It's a religious experience. There's a verse in the Psalms that says, Va'ani tefillah, I am prayer. Some of the commentaries in the Middle Ages were, I suppose, uncomfortable and changed and said, well, it means I am praying. But it is, I am prayer. And I think that's what nonviolence was about. I think it was what Dr. King and the other civil rights leaders were trying to cultivate in their own lives. How do I make myself, my life, a prayer? How do I live in a way that I am a prayer? Not that I'm just reading a prayer, but I become a prayer. Dr. King told my father that the march in Selma, he told him on that day, this was the greatest day of my life, he said. My father came back from Selma, and he said, I felt my legs were praying. Va'ani tefillah, I am prayer. I think that's what it was to be a Hasidic Rebbe in Europe, to devote your life to being a prayer, to pray intensely, but also to know that in everything you do in Hasidic tradition, every gesture, every interaction with a person is a moment of prayer. Someone could come to a Hasidic Rebbe and pour out their heart and their troubles and their worries and the terrible things happening, a sick child, God forbid. One of my father's ancestors, the Abda Rav, Avram Yeshua Heschel of Abt, the person for whom my father was named, who died in 1825, but he had a famous statement. He said, when people come to me and they tell me their sorrows, their troubles, their problems, I open my heart. And their problems enter my heart and they make a scar in my heart. And when I go to pray, I open my heart to God and I say, look at all these scars. Va'ani tefillah. And I just think, what does it mean to listen to someone in such a way that their problems make a scar in your heart? For me to think about, what is it like to talk to someone who listens in that way, to know that that person is responding like that. My father was like that as a person. I felt his heart was so big, so open, and I could tell him anything, and his empathy was extraordinary, and his love was extraordinary and enthusiastic and warm. But he was also someone who worried very much about the state of the world, what to do, what should we do. Nowadays, there is great despair in the Black communities in the United States, in South Africa, and elsewhere. It's understandable. We know in Jewish tradition, despair is forbidden. Despair is to suggest that God is not present, but God is present. But sometimes despair overwhelms us. And I can understand why someone would feel despair as a Black person in this country. What does it mean for people who stand for the law committing murder? And you know, we see also what it means to be a bystander, something that we as Jews have thought about for a long time in relation to the Holocaust. Bystanders who did nothing. But I think about George Floyd, for example. There were bystanders, police, who did nothing. There is in Black intellectual life, a movement that is called Afro-pessimism. And it has some resonance for Jews also. Afro-pessimism is an expression of despair. It's a pessimism that says nothing will ever get better, that it will always be like this, that there is a hatred of Black people that can never, ever be eradicated. I understand that despair, and in fact, there's a long Jewish tradition that says anti-Semitism is so deep-seated around the world it can never be eradicated. A Judeo-pessimism. If we say that Afro-pessimism is inappropriate, we have to also question our Judeo-pessimism. But I was in South Africa at the University of Cape Town for a Holocaust conference in August of 2012, and I came on a Thursday and Friday morning in the hotel. I had the newspaper with a very big headline about a massacre outside Cape Town, Marikana, a massacre of Black men who worked in the mines and who were demonstrating, standing outside the mine with placards, demanding better wages. The mine owners called the police arrived, white police with machine guns, and murdered them all. And so, in a recent book called The Black Register by Tendai Sidholi, a South African philosopher, he speaks about Afro-pessimism. Is there some way that white people think of Black people as non-life? Is it possible that the police murdering George Floyd and so many others think they're not committing murder because a Black person is not really alive? Is that possible? Is it possible that this civilization has come to that? Now, I understand pessimism and despair, but I also understand that there are those theologians who work very hard to uphold hope and religiosity and belief that God is not absent but with us. And they need our support and our alliance. I think of Esau McCauley's book called Reading While Black, which talks about the emotions of being Black, the rage and the hope, and the impact of that racism on a person's life. But he also says, look what the Bible does for us. The Bible gives expression to those feelings of rage and of hope. Israel's pain and anger in the prophets and in the Psalms. Reading those is a way, he says, of processing Black grief. James Cone, theologian, points out that God's choice of the children of Israel in Egyptian slavery to be God's chosen people, that speaks to God's own character. He writes, if God had chosen as his holy nation the Egyptian slave masters instead of the Israelite slaves, a completely different kind of God would have been revealed. I'm struck by the wonderful alliances with Black and Jewish intellectuals. I think of Cornel West, who speaks always about anti-Semitism when he speaks about racism in his public addresses or on television, always both. I think about Saidia Hartman, a professor at Columbia University, whose work on racism has helped me and others understand anti-Semitism much more deeply by taking into consideration trauma. Too often we write about anti-Semitism without thinking about the impact on Jews. We collect the anti-Semitic statements and images, but the trauma also has to be considered. And finally, I just want to say in conclusion, again, how much it meant to my father, to me growing up, and to so many Jews, that relationship my father had with Dr. King. After what my father went through, after we as a Jewish people went through, 6 million murdered, what restores our souls? What gives us back our Jewish lives, our pride in being Jewish, our joy in being Jewish. Some of it is Shabbat, the Sabbath. And my father wrote a beautiful book about the Sabbath. He writes about the Sabbath as the soul of the rest of the week. 6 days were created, and the Sabbath comes as a soul. And you know, Jews are said that on the Sabbath, we also receive an additional soul. And what soul is that? It's the soul of Moses, we're told in Jewish tradition. Moses enters our soul. And when that additional soul returns to heaven after the Sabbath, God asks, "And what insights of Torah have you learned on this Sabbath?" The Sabbath is supposed to remind us of standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, about to receive the revelation. I mention this just because I want to say what my father came from in going to the civil rights movement. For him, all of Judaism, from Abraham to the present, all of it was part of him and part of our lives as Jews. Judaism isn't something out there, it's within us. And he brought that Judaism in his heart, in his soul, that tradition that he had grown up in, the Hasidic tradition, with its extraordinary emphasis on acting with refinement, on making the world a better place, and having other people's troubles enter your heart. That's what he brought to Selma. And that's what he said. I felt my legs were praying. Va'ani tefillah, he became a prayer. And I believe that all those who stood up for what is right and just also became people of prayer. And I hope we can continue to be inspired by them and continue in their path going forward. We need them as much as they need us. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask a couple of questions, and then maybe if other people have some questions, we can take some questions. So I did want to mention that there were some famous German Protestant theologians who were opposed to Nazism.
Oh, of course, absolutely.
Martin Niemöller, of course. I mean, you almost kind of referenced him when you were speaking.
And
but
Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
And Dietrich Bonhoeffer,
Yes.
of course. So there were, of course, those as well.
Yes, and Bultmann also, Rudolf
Yeah,
Bultmann,
right.
and yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
so
there
we
were
don't
many
want
more.
to
Okay.
don't want to
Yes,
overlook
don't
them,
wanna say-
and
right.
also that your father had a very good relationship with the guys across the street from the seminary, right, at
Yes.
Union Theological
Yeah,
Seminary.
absolutely.
So maybe you want to say a few words about that.
I think actually my father used to say that he felt his work was better understood by Christians than by Jews. Too often Jews, I mean, I find it somewhat extraordinary, but people would say to me when I was a child, some of my father's Jewish colleagues, your father's work is just poetry. Just poetry, right? Like T.S. Eliot had no ideas, right? It was just poetry. But who says that to a child? So I don't know what was really going on, some kind of envy or resentment, I'm not sure. But my father had very close relationships with Christian theologians, especially his friendship with Reinhold Niebuhr, which was very profound. Reinhold Niebuhr was one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Protestant theologian and ethicist in the 20th century in America. And they were so close that Dr. Niebuhr asked my father to deliver the eulogy at his funeral, which he did. And that's extraordinary. When in 2,000 years has a Christian theologian asked a Jew to give the eulogy? And there were others as well, including those involved in the Second Vatican Council, for example. And because of that, the Catholic University in Lublin, Poland, has just established a center for Christian-Jewish relations that they've named for my father. And I'll just mention, one of the things, Lublin is in eastern Poland, and this is considered the most important Catholic university in Poland. But what I like, I have to tell you, one of the things that I like about what they're doing is that They're not only interested in theologians having conferences and discourse and publishing things that only 5 people will read or whatever, but they also want to reach people. So they go to places that are small towns. There are many, many small towns, villages. They go to the village, and together with the priests at the local Catholic Church, they make a day of Judaism, just for local people to come and learn what is Judaism. Now that's really fantastic. The university put up a menorah, a Hanukkah menorah, in front of the university, which is in downtown Lublin, very close to the mall and shopping areas, so that people would see something Jewish in a Catholic institution, that Catholics are affirming Judaism. So I find that extraordinary. And given a long history, I think we need to celebrate efforts like that and respect them, and I'm certainly very grateful. And the fact that they chose my father to name this also is because they realize how intense his engagement with Christian theologians was, and certainly also with Dr. King. So I just have to mention that something, but I'm happy to take questions from everybody. Yes, please.
I have 2 questions. One is, what was the thesis of your father's PhD that he took 3 years to get approved in Germany? I'd be very curious what that was. And the second question is, you talked about it a little bit. What is happening in Israel today? And I've been asking a lot of leaders as to what the American response should be, and our response should be to what is going on in Israel, that many people think is changing the character of Israel, and we're very afraid. I had an Israeli friend of mine who was very right-wing, who emailed me and said, you have no right as a Jew to criticize Israel or to comment about Israel unless you're living in Israel. So he said, shut up, don't say anything about it. And that was his response. I'm just curious, you as someone who was respected by the Jewish community and involved in civil rights, what do you say we should do and how should we react to this?
Well, okay, thank you. I'll just say, first of all, my father's PhD dissertation was a book on the prophets, and he expanded it and published it in English translation in the early 1960s, and in fact, Andrew Young told me that the civil rights leaders carried it as a paperback in their back hip pocket when they went to prison. That's what they were reading. It was a very important book on the prophets. So that was the dissertation. The university approved it, but he had to get it published. In terms of Israel, I'll just tell you that my father and Elie Wiesel, for example, expressed criticism of Israel. I believe it was Golda Meir when Ronald Reagan was given an award as he was then the governor of California, and they objected. So criticism, of course we criticize. We criticize many governments. Criticism doesn't mean rejection. I don't support the boycott, what's called BDS, at all. I think we do need to be engaged. And I also think Israel needs things from us. It needs from us sometimes some advice, some help. I would say, a friend of mine, Protestant theologian in Germany, once said to me, you don't walk out of Auschwitz with a smile on your face. Jews were traumatized, and there's a lot of trauma in Israel too. But someone needs to also calm the rage that is brewing. My father's books have been translated into Hebrew just in recent years, and I think that's helping. I know people have been giving lectures about his work and explaining that there is an alternative to Meir Kahane. There is another way of understanding what it is to be a Jew. And what it is to be a Jew is not only about politics. My father said in a speech to the World Zionist Congress organization in Israel, when the early Zionist movement, BILU, was formed, it's an acronym, Beit Yaakov L'chu V'Nocha, but they left out the last 2 words, B'or Adonai. house of Jacob, go forward. Israel, go forward. Jews, go forward, but in the light of God. They left that out. The Zionist movement was adamantly secular and political and so on. But today we're also facing a problem, a crisis, because a lot of religious Jews don't believe in Israel, don't support the state even. They want the land, but not the state. Ultra-religious Jews, very religious Jews. And some of the Orthodox nationalists in Israel have become very racist. How do we counter that influence? And unfortunately, a lot of American Jews went over to Israel in the 60s and 70s and brought a certain kind of nationalism and fundamentalism from America that was not healthy. Anyway, there's much more to say about it, but I certainly think we have to be engaged and speak out. Yes? Can I? Oh. Sure.
So in a couple of days, we're going to be celebrating Purim. And the Book of Esther isn't exactly a book about nonviolence. Maybe it was Mayor Kahan's favorite book. And I'm wondering if you have any comments about how modern Jews should look at the Book of Esther and the Purim celebration and how we study this and incorporate it into modern feelings about the unity of the grace.
Did everybody hear? Okay. Should I just repeat a little bit?
I'm asking about the holiday of Purim in the Book of Esther, and how Esther, in the Book of Esther, there's a lot of vengefulness and real prejudice, and how that this holiday and this celebration and this book of the Bible can fit into what Dr. Heschel and Rabbi Heschel have been working toward in terms of the unity of the human race.
And of course, Purim is when Baruch Goldstein went into a mosque in Hebron with a gun and killed 29 Muslims at prayer. And unfortunately, his grave has become a place of pilgrimage and honor in Israel, with some of the Israeli leaders today having pictures of Baruch Goldstein on their wall to honor him. What have we come to? What is that? I agree with you. Book of Esther is a fantasy, it's a novel, and it's not intended to be read. It's not as historical fact, it wasn't. And the last chapter is particularly egregious. I'm not sure where it comes from in the sense, but I feel as though what shall I say? It's as if a bunch of, how shall I say this? It's as if a bunch of drunken frat boys got together and wrote something. Forgive me, but I come from Dartmouth, so I can say that. What do we do? What do we do? There are many passages. What do we do with Genesis 34 about the rape of Dinah? Rape is not something that we condone, obviously. How do we read books like this? And how do we handle passages in the Bible that are deeply offensive and egregious to us? So I would say that a book of Esther is describing precisely how one should not behave. And perhaps we need to read it in that vein. Perhaps it should be a holiday that's not a happy, joyous celebration, but on the contrary, mourning, because I think what's going on right now in Israel and what just happened in a Palestinian village, which has been called by Israel Bartal, Professor Bartal, one of the most important Jewish historians in the world, a great scholar of East European Jewish history who has published on pogroms, and he called it a pogrom, which shocked me, but I have to take it seriously. When a group of Jews in Israel go into a Palestinian village and rampage and destroy property, and beat people up, it's a pogrom. How can it be that we do this? So maybe the book of Esther has to be read as a mirror to what's going on right now, that this is not right and that this needs to stop and that this is dangerous. We're in a bad situation right now, as we know, but You don't need me to tell you this. We have this already. And I think my friends in Israel are begging for support. Those who are very concerned that the Supreme Court will be canceled by this new government, they're begging for our support. Yes? And not what? And not be passive? Patsy. Speak loudly. That's a very interesting question, or it's interesting that you hear it that way, and I appreciate it. I would say, for example, those who were freedom riders, those who marched in Selma, for example, that was great courage. That was prayer as an act of courage, an act of solidarity with others. It was prayer the way I would imagine Amos, for example, praying as an act of justice. Standing up for justice, even putting oneself at risk for justice, that too is prayer. My father said, I felt holiness in that march. Why? They weren't in a synagogue, they weren't in a church, but they were praying for justice by marching. So that courage, actually, was not being a patsy, but it was courageous. Yes? Thank you. So the comment was that, I'm about to repeat it, yes, that the iconic photograph of my father with Dr. King at Selma, that photograph, when you have a wide angle and you see more broadly, you see rabbinical students who came to Selma. There weren't that many, not as many students as my father would have liked. And there were students who complained that he had to reschedule a class. So not everybody was with him, and certainly not one of his colleagues. And my father was also involved in the movement against the war in Vietnam. The reason is that Seymour Melman at Columbia University had presented evidence that he had gathered from the military officers in Vietnam that we were committing war crimes, that we had no strategy, no military strategy, that we were simply dropping bombs and destroying people's farms and land and dropping napalm on children. It was a war crime. And when my father realized that, he formed an organization, Clergy and Laymen Concerned About Vietnam, in the fall of 1965. And Dr. King spoke out against the war. And I'll tell you that in those days when I was growing up, politics was not political. Politics was about ethics. And it was a moral issue. Should Dr. King speak out against the war? What would it do to the civil rights movement? Should my father encourage him to speak out? What would happen? The president would turn against him, Congress would. And in fact, when Dr. King spoke out against the war at Riverside Church in April of 1967, a year before he was assassinated, and I was there that night, and my father introduced him, and Dr. King gave a very important speech that is rarely cited because it was a speech about the United States and where are our priorities. But He was attacked the next day by civil rights leaders, by newspapers all over the country. Black civil rights leaders, don't get involved in imposing the war in Vietnam. It's none of your business. Dr. King says it is. It is. Young black men being sent off to Vietnam, being killed. United States spending all this money. And what is it doing to our souls as a country that we're dropping napalm on people, war crimes? What does it do to a country? And believe me, it does terrible things to a country, to all of us. So does the whole incarceration system of this country. It's not only those who were in the military in Vietnam who were affected by what we were doing, all of us. It's not only those who are locked up in the hell of a prison, what Job called hell. Prison is hell. But all of us, that we live in a society in which human beings are incarcerated and treated horribly and demeaned and robbed of dignity. And dignity was so important to my father and to the civil rights movement. Dignity was central. Yes?
I don't think that when your father was alive, the term reparations was very much used. But if he was alive today, what would reparations to the black community look like, particularly from a sense of Jewish justice?
So the question is about reparations. The issue of reparations to black Americans is something that was not being discussed in the 1960s when my father was alive, but it is being discussed today. And I think it is very important. It's important for those who were descended from people who had nothing and were robbed of everything, who were enslaved, and it's important to us. It's important to us to repent and to do something meaningful. You know, many universities have done so. Some communities, cities, small cities. I think it's something that will grow. And I think my father would have felt, yes, this is the right thing to do. I would just say, though, that my father also felt the wealthiest country in the history of the world, and people can't buy the medicine that they need. How can that be? Yes? So, okay, the question has to do with my comment that we wouldn't accept the apology of Jesse Jackson, and the next thing came Louis Farrakhan. I think that the way that Jesse Jackson was treated was shameful. I think it would have been quite extraordinary if the Jewish community had said, thank you, Mr. Reverend Jackson. Thank you for your apology, we accept it, and let's now work together and be allies. That would have been great. Why Farrakhan? Because there was a vacuum created. Keep in mind, Jews withdrew from the March on Washington in '83. It was public knowledge. I'm not saying in a direct way that Jews created, yeah? But the resentment that's created in the black community by our failure to accept an apology is a resentment that they say, why not accept the apology? Why can't we move on here? And that resentment leads us, I can't work with these Jews. Then what if, anybody can make a mistake, and after all, don't Jews also make racist comments? Do we apologize for those? Okay, I'm not saying that the Jews are responsible for Louis Farrakhan, but I think Jews created some resentment that made Farrakhan's anti-Semitic remarks seem plausible to a lot of black people.
What do we do about the rise today? What can we do as Jews to fight against it?
I'll just say there's somebody who seems to be very anxious to participate in this question, so let's bring him in. Is that all right? Do you want to comment on this? A related question? Go ahead. What? Al Sharpton. So I think we have two issues here. One issue, certain individual figures, such as Al Sharpton, Louis Farrakhan, or Jesse Jackson, and there are others I could point to as well, who have said or done things that we find extremely upsetting and offensive and unacceptable. And then there's a question that was asked, what about anti-Semitism in the Black community? One problem I have is to speak of Black anti-Semitism. I don't see it that way. I do think there's anti-Semitism on the far left and anti-Semitism on the far right, and they, in a sense, ultimately coming together as if they are saying the same thing, allies in some way. There is an extremism in this country. That extremism is appealing to people, both white and Black. That's a concern. That's the issue. Why the extremism? Why the polarization? And why is it so appealing to people? The anti-Semitism, the resentment, the hatred among both white people and Black people is tied to many things. Sociologists talk about it. We've all read all of those studies. We know about that. Economic resentment, etc. I think there's resentment within the Black community sometimes at the iconic photo of my father with Dr. King. Well, people will say, enough already with that. We've heard about that for so long. It was 1965. Here's 2023. Now what? And since 1965, think about all the other things that have happened. Andrew Jackson was U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and asked by the president, Jimmy Carter, to speak to some PLO representatives privately at the UN. And he did. He's told by the president he has to. And then it was announced in the newspapers, it was revealed, and he had to resign as ambassador. Pressure, again, from Jewish organizations. That's a mistake. We have made many mistakes that have led to resentment, and we need to accept that we have made mistakes. We can't be stuck in the past. So what do we do going forward? I don't know how many Jewish organizations bring in Black intellectuals to speak. How many people have heard from Frank Wilderson, who wrote the book Afro-Pessimism, for example? Sometimes we don't invite certain speakers. Andrew Young came to speak at the Heschel School in New York City, and there were people who objected. The Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. gave its Elie Wiesel Award to Congressman John Lewis, and there were people who objected. Why? 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 I don't understand it. But I think we have a problem. And I think we sometimes think we're seeing Black anti-Semitism when we're not. And that in fact what we're seeing is something that is our problem, a kind of suspicion, because we don't really know what's going on. How many people read these books that I mentioned today, Saidiya Hartman or Cornel West or James Cone or Issa Macaulay? We don't have a conversation going. Maybe if we had a conversation, maybe if we were reading these books and having these people come to speak in our synagogues and JCCs, we would feel more comfortable. We would see a different picture and not just what we read in a newspaper, let's say. So I think that would be helpful. You're asked about Al Sharpton? What about Al Sharpton? What do you want to know about Al Sharpton? What? He said some terrible things at one point. He was young. It was a big mistake. It was awful. What can I say? He's become now in his senior years a very good preacher. He goes to preach at funerals for Black men who have been killed by the police. Good. I'm glad he's preaching. After all, we as Jews have a very strong principle, which is tshuva. That is, when somebody repents, it's accepted. You can repent to the very last second of your life. Someone can be, even the most Orthodox, I come from very Orthodox relatives, no matter what. If you have lived a life that's completely secular and not religious, then you become Orthodox, you're accepted. They don't hold it against you that you were once upon a time anti-religious. Okay.
Thank you very much, Dr. Heschel. I think one of the remarks you made at the end is maybe a take-home message for us. I think listening to black scholars, reading books, but really engaging with the African American community. I think really a lot of distrust, fear, whatever is promoted by lack of understanding, lack of communication. I think the more we interact with people who aren't like us, right, the more we learn about them, the more they learn about us. And I think that's the way we can dispel this, this kind of senseless fear and anxiety that people have among different groups of people. And certainly that's one of the things that we try to promote here, and we hopefully will continue to do here. And I think that's something that really your father was a part of in the movement in his time, and something maybe that lapsed over time, but I think it's something that now we can reignite and further develop. And that from that we can develop relationships that are stronger and promote more understanding and acceptance among different groups of people. We mentioned before at a dinner that Stephen Kleinberg is the demographer for Houston. He just moved, he just retired. He often would remark that Houston is the most diverse city in the country and sort of the future of America in general. But it's really up to us as Houstonians to break down the barriers and the silos that we operate in so that we get to know each other better. And then we can be a model for the United States as a whole. So thank you very much for coming. A reception outside, so if you want to stay for a little bit, there's some refreshments outside.